Thank you for your time. My name is Betula, and this is Bet on It, Shooting from the Hip. I appreciate you being here. Please keep in mind what we're doing here on Bet on It, Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, and noteworthy information. This exploration is us simply thinking aloud, a thought exercise, if you will, jumping into ideas and examining them and re-examining them. You will find we're prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We are not experts of any kind. We are just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information in the hopes that you will find it fun, interesting, and entertaining. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now on with the shit show. Slim, how you doing, buddy?
Fantastic this October 4th.
Oh, yes. A wonderful day recording out in early fall. So this is a rarity for us to do this, but that's because we have too much of a cluttered space to do it indoors. So having said that, today's episode, we're going to talk about the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphic mysteries. And these are from the classical period, so that would have been that'd be ancient Greece and that time frame. And these were celebrated rituals that you could, I guess, say would be parallels to celebrating Christmas, Halloween, any of those. I guess even Valentine's Day, I suppose, where we set aside the day to sort of, for whatever reason, to celebrate something specific. Well, they did it too, but theirs had a much more profound kind of function in the way they viewed themselves and the way they experienced their reality. Because remember, in that time, most people were largely illiterate, and they had polytheistic faiths, so they didn't have the kind of availability of information that we kind of experience today, that we benefit from it. So you can explore, which is what we do largely here on in this podcast. So we explore different ideas, and for them, they didn't have the benefit. Here, we actually get information overload. Most people can't deal with all the information, but having said that, there's no excuse for them not being able to source out virtually any subject, right? People are super fond of Google, and that's what they turn to, right? It's the answer man for all their questions. Well, that didn't exist in the classical periods, right? But what they did have is they did have the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphic mysteries, right? So these are ritual events that basically paralleled each other. So just to give you a time frame of what we're talking about, this all occurred between, it's speculated, or as far as academics understand, it started in the 1600s before the Common Era, and ended in the Common Era 392 years ago. So basically 1600 years ago it came to an end. And then for basically almost 2,000 years before that, it was an active part of the ancient Greek culture, and news of it spread wide and far in that time. So we'll get into it more specifically. Now, the focus of the Eleusinian mysteries, as it's tied to their polytheistic faiths, was about the abduction of Persephone, the queen of the Underworld, and she was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, goddess of the harvest and fertility, also called Kor, which means kind of maiden, and grew up to be a lovely girl, attracting the attention of many gods. Daughter of Demeter by Hades, and her eventual release to the condition that she returned annually to the underground. So what it was is the celebration of the transition from the growing season, which would be spring and summer, to to the fall and winter season. So it really marked that tradition. So in terms of like their religion, remember, it was their way of explaining it, and most people understood that just as their folklore, which they would essentially like spread verbally, like, because it's not like they were walking around with the good book of the Olympian gods underneath their arm, like more conventionally we see today. Virtually any ideology has a core text, and people can own the core text. They're freely available. In that time, they didn't have it, so they told stories that were religious, that explained things that they experienced within the course of a life, right? So the year was broken up between the growing season and the season where once you harvest, now you had to wait to sow crops again, right? So this is how they explained it. It was the god of the underworld, Hades, or Pluto, as he was known by I think the Romans referred to him as Pluto, and the Greeks he was Hades. He was so enamored with the beauty of Zeus's daughter with Demeter that he basically, the story goes that he tricked her into coming into hell, and then Demeter demanded her return at the express concern of the old father Zeus, right? So he had to capitulate and agree, but what he did was, just before she left to return to leave the underworld, he gave her the seeds of a pomegranate, and that was the trick to trap her. So she had to always come back because she consumed the pomegranate seeds, right? So at least that's the story, right?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, it makes sense.
No, I know.
It's just the madness of their theology at that time, right? It's their religion, and it's how they explained the transition of seasons. So to mark the transition of the seasons, right, is when they instituted like these rituals to celebrate this event, which was tied to the real world, even though it was completely their explanation of it was entirely mythological, right? But again, it just makes for an interesting story to imagine that. You can imagine like a mature adult telling to small children, this is the origin of transition from summer to fall and winter and then back to spring. So anyway,
Oh, if I can add to that.
Go ahead, please do.
Any culture, any theology, of course, it's born out of the culture it came from. So there's a lot of these stories that they probably just grew up hearing, and because of that, they never thought to go out and question it, examine it, things like that.
They weren't. I don't think that they were smart enough to even be able to do that.
I don't think it would be practical for them either.
No, and remember, most of their like advanced thinking and stuff like that, it was meant for a select few, so it wasn't open to the general public. We're like, think about post-secondary education here and now. So as long as you can demonstrate that you have you meet the basic minimum requirements, they'll take you on as a student. In that time, they had universities, but they were highly specialized, and you had to demonstrate, great mental acuity, which here you don't have to do that. So they only took the most thoughtful and forward kind of thinking people, and then that. So you think of like people like Pythagoras, like it was almost a cult, but it was a cult of academics, right? Like because they were the most intelligent people of their time, so they would congregate unto themselves. What do you think the rest of the masses were doing? They were agrarian cultures, right? So they were, if they weren't farming, they were servants, right? So
I think it makes sense to born out an ideology or a system of understanding from these intellectuals. From their perspective, they're the only educated people within like miles and miles and miles. It may be beneficial to have a culture based around what they learned in those universities. Now it seems like it's a little different, but it is nice to see that education is just so available. Like it's kind of like food. We're getting fat from it.
Uh, Sorry, I got caught up in reading my notes. So can you just sum that up in one sentence? I'm sorry, I really apologize. Normally I can do both, read and listen, but I just totally brain farted. Right,
Oh, I
sorry.
smell it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I was just saying essentially that the the culture that comes from information is necessary, but now we're over encumbered by all this
Yeah, because
information.
it's so widespread. There's so much of it. You become overstimulated, so then you shut down to it
Oh,
because it's just
especially
too much to absorb, right?
yes, of course. And like with the narratives associated with it, not only can you look at the facts, but you also have to take the narratives with it. It's well, you don't have to, but a reactionary mind would.
Okay, yeah, I agree. So, but here's the thing. Even highly, like when you look at, we talked about Pythagoras and his cult, right? Like Pythagorean cult, all right, and they were advanced thinkers. So it seems to me we think of typically we associate simple-minded thinkers as being easily swayed, and I think that sometimes it's highly intellectualized thinkers who are easily swayed. The difference is that the highly intellectualized ones, they convince themselves,
Right.
whereas as the ones who are more simple or basic, they're convinced by others, right? So they're both wrong.
I genuinely agree with that. I see
Yeah.
that all over. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not enough to be intelligence, but then it has to be coupled with competence and kind of like a practical wisdom, which you don't see. You see what you see is typically, especially those who have inflated view of themselves because of their intellect. They're so caught up in their ego, they think everybody else is stupid, right?
I think part of the issue is, especially nowadays, people get so emotionally invested in these like one-off factoids that don't really mean anything to their personal lives. So like these individuals that are inundated with stress in and out every day, like it's almost more detrimental that they're intelligent because of that. They get authority to go, oh, I know what I know.
Right, so they get caught up in their own authority that they know better, that
Right,
no matter whatever the topic or subject is, that ultimately they should have final say because they know better than everybody else.
right, and that's
Uh,
impossible.
again, I think it speaks to like the failure of intellects, right? That they're supposed to, they see themselves as the broadest and open mind, but you can convince yourself of that and not necessarily be that because again, because you're exercising a bias that you then and in in the instance that we're talking about, their bias is that they know better. And the bias is that they're more intelligent than everybody else, which is kind of like again, it is, it's a fallacy. It just now it's just this ideology of themselves that they got caught up in instead of look, the real objective kind of observation is born out of somebody who has no vested interest in what they're observing. They just see things for what they are. And that's how you see things for what they are, by not being personally invested in whatever it is that you're looking at. Again, which is another way of saying bias. That's what bias is. It's a personal investment in whatever specifically that you might be addressing or looking at, right? And in that objective observation, there's far more clarity because there's no bias influencing the observation, right? Hence the objectivity,
Yeah.
right?
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I was thinking like, at its worst, you could describe it as like arrogance. This concept of there's nothing out there that can influence me, and that is, in my opinion, anti curiosity,
Yeah,
which is a
I
fundamental
agree.
force.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. That sums it up nicely. So getting on with the Eleusinian and Orphic mysteries. Now, the Orpheism was a mystery cult associated with the mythical poet Orpheus and various poems and songs attributed to him. Practiced as a version of the Dionysian religion. Remember, in that time in ancient Greece, polytheistic faith, many, many gods, right? So Orphics worshipped the god Dionysus and Persephone, and both of them were believed to have traveled to the underworld and returned. So you know, they were the dead, and then they're no longer dead. They traveled to the underworld, the land of the dead, and then returned alive, right? So again, you could see in a culture where they don't have a more express or explicit understanding of the nature of like death and dying, and what that means to the physical body, that somehow, and that their belief that there is a place of the dead, right? Like much like this place. So it's a place that where you have experiences. So anyway, so their focus, because they worship both Dionysus and Persephone, they 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 were, their views wasn't any different than, say, Christ rising from the dead, right? It's not any different. So you see that tradition really, really early on. So it's been around with us for like probably close to 4,000 years, this view, right? But I think it speaks to, again, the mystery of death and dying, like, because there's no definitive answers, although there are many who would tell you absolutely what happens when we die, but the reality is no one knows, and you can't apply the scientific method because you can't venture into death and then return to report what you've seen. Although there are people who would claim that, right, they out of body experiences or near death experiences, sorry, they make claims and they do allege that that they had post death experiences, but again, it can't be proved and or disproved, which is awfully convenient, because then it makes it easy for them to be able to continue to believe in it, right? So I ask for no faith. I just want evidence. If there's no evidence, cool, then it just means we don't know, right? So now, having said that, it was also a ritual that they would celebrate, right? And typically it'd be more, I'm going to go on a limb and assume that it was more for those who were Orphics, like that, the way they refer to themselves, right? So remember, they were a cult, and based on this mythical poet Orpheus, who he's the one who would in story and poetry would convey the story of Persephone and Dionysus. So having said that, you can see, like, it's not any different than in the polytheistic faith. It allowed for worship of different deities and still be considered part of the same body of religious worship, right? But not everybody would celebrate the Orphic mysteries. Now, however, the Eleusinian mysteries were, because they were centered in Athens, the expectation was that everybody would experience the Eleusinian mystery at least once, right? So Eleusis was an egalitarian ritual, the Eleusinian ritual, which are referred to as Eleusis. Everybody was expected to participate, and at its height, up to 3,000 initiates could be received at one time. So they would when they would run the ritual, you could have 3,000 people there, all waiting for their turn to have the experience, right? So everyone was expected to participate, and it was open to everyone, and that included men, women, slaves, and even children, right? And there were two conditions of entry. First, each initiate had to understand Greek, and even foreigners who took part. and that was to understand the language in order to grasp what was said during the ritual, right? Because they to them it was important that you knew what was being said. So I could see, because again, people would come as far away as India to experience the Eleusinian mysteries, which would occur. This event would occur once a year. So they would probably not be fluent in Greek, but they might have translators who are fluent in Greek and their language of that they spoke, so that they would get the direct translation. And the second condition was initiates could not be guilty of homicide. There could be no blood on their hands, so they couldn't be killers of any kind. So it immediately excluded like the entire warrior caste and stuff. Only those who had actually shed blood, right? And it wasn't there was a third condition, but it wasn't one that anyone observed, and it was that you could only do the ritual once in a lifetime. There was people who did it once a year, every year of their life, right? So it's like Oktoberfest here, right? Everybody experiences it way more than once, right? You got something you want to say?
Oh, it was about the origin of Oktoberfest. How apparently, this is what I've heard. I'm not sure if it's true or not. Supposedly, somebody got married, an official or a king, very huge party, and then they were like, you know what, that party was so good, let's have it every single year.
Oh, I didn't know that there was your. I've been
I
living
don't
here
know
my
if
whole
it's
life,
true.
and it's the big thing in October here in KW, and I had no idea that that was the origin. But I'll be real frank with you, I never really cared why like what the origin was. We had just at the peak of my enjoyment of it, and never factored into it.
Well, I mean, it's nothing so personal. Like if you were there at the time of Eleusinian mysteries and you're in the line, there's something meaningful there compared to going to a tent. And
Well, because this, we're going to describe the details of the ritual, but you're going to find it super interesting. It's like it really was this cultural, quasi-religious kind of experience that produced a profound effect in the individuals who experienced it, right? So, anyway, but so we're going to just get to that. And it was also they it was also reduced to a personal choice in terms of like whether or not you wanted to experience. There was lots of Athenians who it was part of their culture and they just didn't, right? So that was the other thing, that it was really dependent on the individuals to want to be a participant, right? And the initiates had when they showed up for the experience, it had to be on an empty stomach, right? So and we're going to get to why. They would drink the ritual drink kaikion, and kaikion was a brew that you might look at like wine or beer, and so because there was barley and wheat involved in it, but it wasn't exclusively barley and wheat, and the wheat would get infected by a fungus. I think it was I can't remember the name of the fungus. I want to say ergot, but I can't be certain. Mixed with the barley and the wheat, and then in the fermentation process would create a potent hallucinogenic, right? Like, so again, it speaks to ayahuasca in South America and the traditions there, right? So again, it's this relationship that pre-formal religions like a focused religion like Christianity and Islam and say Judaism, where a ritual sacrament was imbibing like this stuff that was a hallucinogen, and it was to amplify your experience of whatever the ritual of this particular, in this case, the Eleusinian ritual, right? So they had long entrance halls of the sanctuary and a large cave beneath the Acropolis, which would they considered the entrance to Hades, called the Plutonian. So they would imbibe this shit, they'd start tripping balls, and then now they go into a cave where the only light is a torchlight, right? So you can only imagine the kind of experiences that they ended up having as a result of that. So so you could see like if they're having the kind of experiences that we often associate with like entheogens, like ayahuasca, where the experience they're having becomes as real as their waking day-to-day experience, like that they can't make the distinction, that because it's that convincingly real to them. So for them, it would resolve, for so many of them, it would resolve their fear of death, right? So when you think of it in those terms, and remember, it's at a time where most people don't really understand death. They have a mythological narrative or story that they tell with regards to it, but the fact of the matter is that they don't really, it's not something that they really discuss, right? Except unless you're philosophers, of course, right? So the end result was that it gave people peace of mind, right?
If I can add to that, there's a few different cultures that do this where they use a hallucinogen. For example, ayahuasca was to kind of introduce the idea that, like, you know, you're going to go into battle and something's going to happen. You may die. So you have to experience death. You have to not be scared of it.
I'm not entirely sure that I could see where that would be a benefit for somebody who's about to do that, but I think they used it more like a religious sacrament to affirm life through coming to terms with death, right? So
that's what I've heard. But that's the thing. You also say they go back for the Hallucinian mystery every year. Why would you want to do that?
Think of it. Why do people have multiple ayahuasca experiences? It's because the experience itself is so potent that once you've had it, you're like going, I don't want to be like that every day, but I would like to experience that again. Because I think part of it too is that no matter how intense the experience is, the aftermath of the experience, you're trying to unpack what you experienced. You're trying to go, here, like what was it that I experienced? So you think about it, and you consider the experience itself and what it may or may not have mean to you, right? So I think it's not any different than people who use hallucinogens as a sacrament, not recreationally, like as for shits and giggles, right?
Right. That was kind of the point I'm leaning towards. Like going year after year into the catacombs or the plantos.
Plutonian is what they referred to the caves underneath. You know where the Acropolis is? It's in the center of Athens. I think it's the center of Athens.
The center of Athens.
It's on the highest feature in the center of the city, and they have a temple. I think I'm fairly certain it's the Temple of Zeus. It might be Temple of Athena, because Athens was named after the goddess Athena. So not relevant, but there was catacombs underneath it, caves, and so you can imagine wandering through there. So that's part of the experience. It's not enough that you're on hallucinogens, tripping balls, but now you're in this dark space that's lit by like torch or I don't know that they had candles at the time, so probably by torchlight, and you probably had to carry your own torch, and so now you're having all these experiences, and you're not. I don't imagine that they're doing it as a group. I imagine that they're just wandering the catacombs by themselves, right? So you can only imagine then what kind of experiences they were having, and again, probably very powerful ones.
Yeah, I assume it's very different than the way we treat holidays here, especially.
But think about what people do here during holidays, like celebrating like I don't mean children, but like adults celebrating Halloween, Christmas, or New Year's. People typically drink to the point where they're intoxicated, right? Like, so how's to me like it's not really any different, at least in principle. It's the same fucking thing. The difference is the kind of drug that they're using. Alcohol is like a real shitty drug that actually, if you drink enough of it, either you black out or you become a rageaholic, right? So and again, it's the kind of thing that like I always found it unsatisfying, right? Drinking, and mostly because I was a puker, right? Like, and I never really enjoyed it. I never enjoyed the way that, like, particularly the way that it tasted. And people used to tell me, "No, it's an acquired taste. Don't worry, you'll get used. You'll get used to it." I go, "Why would I want to get used to it? It doesn't taste good at all. Like, so why would? Where's the appeal, right?" So kind of probably explains why they like not flavor alcohols like vanilla and strawberry, like, but it's because genuinely it doesn't taste good at all. And think about how people consume like things like rum and vodka and stuff. They add it to juices and sodas and
Yeah,
to make it more palatable, right?
yeah, everything seems to be like a supporting thing to make something more enjoyable. But this pilgrimage, the Eleusinian mysteries, where they go through, I keep calling them catacombs.
That's accurate. They're caves. They're catacombs underneath the Acropolis, right? So
I just find it interesting how significant this was to them. Like, it wasn't, I'm doing air quotes here, what we call a holiday. It was a pilgrimage. It was
yeah,
a
100%. It's not any different than somebody making the pilgrimage to Mecca to walk in circles around or in worship, right? So it's again, it's their version of it. It's funny. One time, I had a discussion with a friend who was Roman Catholic. So he identified as a Christian, and much later in his life became a practicing Christian. But prior to becoming a practicing Christian, he was a borderline alcoholic, assaholic, right? So, anyway.
Thank God I found God.
So yeah, actually, as he matured, that's what he did. He returned back to what he knew, um, and he really leaned on the question of faith because his faith allowed for him to ultimately justify his opinions.
Oh, that's not good.
No, it was because he couldn't support his opinions outside of his faith. Like, so he
Right.
couldn't bring evidence to support the opinion. So it just became for him an ultimate justification. So then one time I said to him, "Do you think that anybody who say believed in like the Olympian gods and they faithfully believed in these gods, that their faith was somehow less pure than yours because their gods don't exist?" And I was like, "To you, they don't exist,
Right.
but to them,
Okay, no, it didn't work. It's good.
but to them, their faith was, as far as I could see, as objectively speaking, their faith was no less pure than his with regards to his choice of divinity, and ultimately none of them can prove or disprove. So I'm going so then in essence they're the same in that capacity. So then one's, as far as I can see, one's no better than the other. Although they would argue that theirs is ultimately the best, right?
Yeah, it seems silly. It's like, oh, there's only one true religion. We just happen to have it now. It's like, no, we all have stories that bifurcated.
Yeah,
Separate.
bifurcation. Yeah.
Okay, so I pronounced it right.
Yeah, you did say it right.
Yeah, we have all these just like mild differences to great differences between the old stories and the new stories. It's not necessarily that any of them are correct or wrong. It's just the meaning we draw from them is, it could be practical, but it's meaningless to the individual.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
Philosophy can replace a lot of ideologies.
Again, I completely agree. But I think ultimately the idea is that, because we are talking about the Eleusinian mysteries and how they actually used entheogens as sacraments, and prior to the advent of the formalized Abrahamic religions, it was more common than not, right? So that's the kind of the point of this conversation, that we look back at that time with our current lens, and then you go like, well, they were just all spaced out on drugs. Well, that might be true, but they also treated it not in with a they had a different reverence for what they were doing, because for them it was reaffirming their lives, whereas it's the same thing that faith has now, except the added component to them was that they would, induce this experience that would actually be the thing that would reinforce their, their views on life and this reality, right?
Right. And that's a huge stabilizing force.
I agree. I agree. I think it's what allowed for them to continue to function, particularly in a world where I imagine fear must have been high on their minds, because they just out of ignorance, because they didn't know enough to know that probably didn't need to live out of fear.
Speaking to this, the experience of being on ayahuasca, from what I hear, it's not a super fun one. You have a lot of reactions, and
Well, it first of all, and again, I wouldn't know through personal experience. I've never experienced it personally, but from the accounts that I've heard, one, it's an extremely long process, and it initiates with a very uncomfortable experience. You basically purge. You projectile vomit and diarrhea to basically empty the system, and then you enter into like into whatever the experience is, and then that experience, because of the nature of the way that you do it, where you're consuming it in the form of ayahuasca, it's a long drawn out process, so it takes hours. Whereas I know that especially in the West, people are turning on to the DMT experience, and the way so they're the element that makes ayahuasca so potent is DMT, and you can just do DMT, and people here in the West, Canada, and the U.S. Participate in using it, but their experiences are incredibly short. And and again, I wouldn't know. I only going by the accounts by people who've done it, and they experience this short 20-minute intense kind of experience, right? And remember, I think we talked about this in the DMT episode, so you can look that up through the channel. And DMT is dimethyltryptamine. There are formal studies of it only because of how potent, again, it speaks to the potency of it, how potent psychological remedy that it may represent. So now there's studies to that end that are being conducted by very prestigious institutions. So you can take it for what it is. You agree, disagree. It doesn't really matter, right?
I would add to it, there's a long history of these people having the experiences going, this is more real than real.
Right.
So maybe past 1,000, 2,000, much more than that, maybe they have an experience that justifies looking into it.
Okay, so that was a great segue into the entheogenic theory, right? Which is that many scholars have proposed that the potency of the Eleusinian mysteries came from the kykeon's function as an entheogen or a psychedelic agent, right? And it speaks to again to how much the psychedelics are a part of this quasi-ritual, quasi-religious experience, because for experiencers, they equate it to that, right? Like they experience something within the experience. They experience otherworldly intelligences. As far as they're concerned, it's an interaction with something separate from them. It might be just a portion of, it might be their brain on drugs and them having a conversation with themselves. But what if it's not? And what if entheogens open up the nervous system to allow for greater perception, right? Like, again, not to get too derailed in the conversation, the entire experience you have of the real world and I won't air quotes, the real world. The real world, you you experience a small percentage of the real world, and it's tied to your physical senses. And so there are some who make the claim that you're experiencing less than 5% of reality, and that 95% of the reality is you're oblivious to because it's outside your ability to perceive it. So then that means that we're living in a subset of a much larger reality. Well, what if the theogens then open up your perception so you can experience not all 95% of reality, the reality that we don't experience, but a portion of that? So what if it opens you up to 25% of reality? So what could there be existing outside of our perceptions, right? It could be virtually anything.
Some people would argue that it's biohacking that's convincing your brain to do things. Other people, I've had the experience myself. I would say with something not similar to ayahuasca, none of these entheogens. It was
Oh, magic mushrooms will do the same thing for like they're considered an entheogen, right? Like so you, depending on like the dosage that you take. So if you take a heroic dose, then you can have this alteration in experience, right? And again, I wouldn't know.
uh, personally, I felt shit that I have never felt in my life, like strange things. But at the same time, I wouldn't recommend recreationally using mushrooms. I see a lot of people that develop issues from it, and it seems like it's not
Yeah,
necessary.
I think excessive use or too much use can lead to like forms of psychosis. So I think that's the risk you run. But so then if you approach it even-handedly and you don't treat it, you treat it as something that you do sparingly, I think then you would experience benefits. But if if you can't get through the weekend without doing it,
Yeah, you have to have some sort of reference for it. Like you ask any pot smoker that just fine, it's like, oh, it's magic, it's gonna heal you. You meet someone who does it every day, they're like, I'm out $100 every month. This, that.
wow. Again, we live in a society where we pursue everything that we like excessively, and maybe it's inaccurate to say the things that we like. It's the distractions of choice
Yeah, I
that we
think
have.
so.
Yeah. So then we pursue them recklessly, and then damn,
Woo!
that's nasty. So we pursue these distractions of choice, and remember, it doesn't have to be simply reduced to drugs and alcohol, sex, food, virtually anything, right? So we get caught up in the distractions, and then unintentionally that becomes our lives. I go, I'll be real frank with you. As far as I'm concerned, that's no fucking way to live, right? So if that's your angle, that's your approach, um, you're just spinning your wheels until you pass. I'm going, and the alternative is you could have a much more rich and satisfying experience in life. Like I experience, like for me, that's why meditation is a big part of my day-to-day practice. But I don't have these altered, uh, states of consciousness and experience where I suddenly am like transported to another reality that's more real than this one. All I get is I get a greater sense of myself and and the experiences I'm having in the course of meditation. So that's why I favor meditation, right? And I, I do it frequently. I do it 3 times in a day. So, but that's just my bent, my angle. I don't, like I don't project it on people, and I don't have a level of expectation where everyone else is supposed to, you know,
Yeah,
they're
but I agree with you that it seems like it's mostly beneficial to find it in yourself.
well, it's just again, it's something that I choose to do. But we're gonna get more involved in. I want to get back to the Eleusinian mysteries. We're gonna get more into it in a separate episode where what we'll do is we'll talk about meditation in terms of biohacking. So I'll definitively lay out the actual benefits in terms of physiological, psychological. We'll get way deep into it. But right now we're kind of far afield. So anyway, so the initiates would prepare by fasting, and then the ceremony, it would compound the effects of the ceremony, and then they would have like profound spiritual and intellectual experiences, right? And ergot is the fungi that contains an LSD-like psychedelic alkaloid. So in the fermentation process, when they were making the brew to drink, I guess it's a property of wheat and stuff like that, very regularly this fungi can develop in the wheat itself. So they're just using unknowingly, right?
Right. I think you were right when you said ergot. If I remember correctly, that
It is ergot, yeah.
Okay.
It was here in my notes. I got ahead of myself earlier. So, and kaikion in Greek, in ancient Greek, translates to stir or to mix. So that's what they were doing, right? Like whatever this brew was. So they were probably watering it down to make it like easier to drink, right? So there's this ancient Greek drink has various descriptions, and widely believed that kaikion usually refers to the psychoactive compounded brew, as in the case of the Eleusinian mystery. So they may have actually specifically harvested wheat and barley that was infected with the ergot. So they might have been able to visually be able to tell the difference between infected wheat and barley versus stuff that wasn't. And so they might have intentionally actually, right? But again, they can't, it's only speculative. But it again, within many cultures, even at that time, in that classical period, using some form of psychoactive substance was a sacrament in the practices of their religions, right? Remember, it was a practice that only came to an end after the wide vent influence of Christianity in that region, and they just basically outlawed doing it, right? And remember, at its height, people were traveling as far as India, were aware of the Eleusinian mysteries, and there were individuals who could participate and wanted to participate, and then would travel all that distance.
I mean, somebody tells you they have a portal to hell. I mean,
well,
you kind of have to check it out.
Well, it's not a portal, not necessarily a portal just to hell. Their worship was like, it was more about. Remember, ultimately, it's the explanation of the changing of seasons, or the return of living things. So you die and return. So you experience kind of like a mini death and then a mini resurrection, and you get to have that experience yourself. I could see in a time where people were largely like, I'm trying to find the right word, where people were largely unaware of anything about their natural surroundings or what reality was, or even what they were. I mean, not that we know any better now, but now we have an abundance of information which they probably didn't in the classical period. Outside of intellectuals, the average person was just somebody who adhered to cultural folklore and stories that their parents told them, and it was the explanation of all things. So again, for it to have been around for almost 2,000 years, it just says to me how much it was an experience that was not only integrated into their society, but they considered important to have this experience, right? And then all it was required to end it was the advent of priests who somehow knew better, right? Because you could only excellent motorcycle priests who, as far as they were concerned, you could only access divinity through them. I'm going,
Quite literally gatekeeping heaven.
yeah. So I don't, myself personally, I don't like that. And so if you're spiritual in any meaningful way, why do you need a place of worship? Doesn't suddenly, if it's all God's creation, then any place is worthy of worship.
Well,
right?
that's the thing. Sorry, not that's the thing. The thing. The deep. It's less personal. I was gonna say the depersonalization.
Yeah, because it became a more broader kind of generalized kind of thing where it's not important what you experience. Right. And I'm like, that's a very distinct difference between like the Abrahamic religions and then these polytheistic ones that used entheogens, because they're personalizing the experience, so the individual would have their own spiritual awakening as a result of imbibing the
That is an interesting change, because you could think of, like, we use the term legislation, or like essentially paperwork. We use these rules that are written and passed by each other, and we have somebody who changes the rules. Usually it's by appeal to authority.
right.
But to have that, it doesn't necessitate inherently, but it does make it so each individual is less capable and less responsible for the personal well-being and their personal beliefs.
Right. So then, in the classical period, the use of psychedelics provided an individual spiritual experience that allowed for the individual to come to terms with their own existence, right? And then when it was outlawed, then the more popular way of faith became a system of control, because if you have people who are doing what they were doing in the classical period, it opens people up to a much larger world. And I gotta wonder, people like that would be difficult to control because they're truly independent individuals. They have their own experience.
I was just thinking that.
Right? But here, then, with the introduction of like religious authorities, that somehow the individual was basically a peon meant to serve the religious authority. And we see this to be true, like in ancient Greeks, the priestly class favored themselves. They operated with bias, and even though there was royalty, remember, chosen leadership, or chosen because somehow they're directly related to the gods or whatever, it was determined by the priestly class. They would be the ones who feed this horse shit to the general believers, and that somehow they had the divine right to rule. We were only meant to serve them, and we should do as we're told because they know better.
Yeah, the example I would think of is something like, you gotta do this or else you'll burn in hell. Okay. You time travel way back. It's like, you gotta do this or else this god of plant life and fertility is going to be mad at you. You can still go, I don't believe that, and then you plant, and then you're successful, and then the other guy's wrong. It's proof by results, not proof by theological belief.
Well, but that's what it became, right? So right. That you're right, because it became a theocracy, basically. The population ruled by the priestly class. Right, so, and that somehow they knew better because they imagined themselves being a direct connection to the divine, when the reality is, or at least in a spiritual context, everyone could experience the divine. And that's maybe what the Eleusinian mysteries was all about. God, I hope it doesn't start raining. Like, we're getting pelted by light drops. Maybe we're being too offensive. So, right up until the Roman era, the Eleusinian mysteries were practiced, and its end. In the end, the Emperor Julian attempted to restore the Eleusinian mysteries and was the last emperor to be initiated into them. And the closing of the Eleusinian mysteries was 392 BCE by Emperor Theodosius I, reportedly by Eunapius, a historian and biographer of Greek philosophers. Eunapius was initiated by the last legitimate Hierophant, commissioned by the Emperor Julian to restore the mysteries, and had by then fallen into decay. And this is like 396 Common Era, right? During his raiding campaigns in Attica, king of the Goths, Alaric I, accompanied by Christian monks in their dark robes, looted the remains of the shrine. So that was really it was religion was the end of the Eleusinian mysteries, or formal organized religions. So there was tons of notable participants. Asclepius, 524 to 456 BCE, was an ancient Greek tragedian, often described as the father of tragedy, like playwright. Plato, 427, 348 BCE. His teacher was Socrates and Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher of the classical period, considered foundational thinker of Western philosophy and innovator, written dialogues and dialectic forms. That's how his style of writing was, right? And we covered it. We did Plato's Allegory of the Cave. We did an episode on it, and I really love that story, like still to this day, right? All these years, like 30, 40 years later.
It explains understanding in such a good way, and it applies to many things like emotions, personal experiences that are like factual instead of emotional.
So you can see then, like, so even though it was started out as something exclusively for Athenians in Greece, and then spread to probably all the different city-states in Greece, people would make the pilgrimage there, and then eventually it's spread to, like, to outside of Greece, and then in the Roman era, the Romans they gravitated towards the experience and tried to keep the experience alive. But like I said, all you needed were a bunch of Goths and Alaric and all those dark robed Christian monks, and that was the end of it, right?
Yeah, it used to be my relation to the experience, which is related to the god, the greater, whatever. Now it's like, oh, my relation to the god is through this guy, through this system that kind of doesn't represent what it used to.
Well, but here's the thing. As you say, it's prone then to abuses from the religious authorities, and we see this to be true. We know, like, I'm not making this up. That we see that again throughout history, repeatedly, religious authorities abusing their authority to their own personal ends and gains. So
Right.
I'm like, so, and then they're the ones who are supposed to be directing everyone's spiritual existence, when the fact of the matter is, what if nothing else the Eleusinian mysteries demonstrated is that the individual could direct their own experience with the divine. And I gotta say, there's something far more appealing in that than the idea that you've gotta do now as you're told, because that's essentially what any authority is. You're required to do things as they imagine they should be done, right? Because somehow, again, it goes back to somehow they know better. When I say they, remember, any kind of authority, it exists in today's society, right? We suffer from incompetent authorities, and they abound in virtually every kind of institutions, whether they're philosophical or religious institutions to political institutions. Authorities somehow claiming they know better is problematic.
Right. The idea is that the belief should be able to change based on evidence. However, once you build up the institution, like you always say, like it's got this in, it's got a dogma where it needs to be correct in its pursuit, or else the institution is not valid.
Right, and so then what it speaks to is the idea that the institution becomes more important than the individuals that it was meant to serve. Remember, ultimately, the reason it came into existence is because it felt that the average person needed to be looked after. But the reality is that any authoritarian institution only acts in its own interest, and typically with complete disregard for us, right? And most of the people within the institution abuse their authority of the institution.
Yeah, because
Again,
they specialize in it. And they're
well,
like, oh, this is my thing.
well, they what they do is they look after their own self-interest, and then the self-interest of those that they associate with within the institution and outside of the institution.
Oh, two things I would love to bring up is that a lot of these appeals to authority, they come from ego, whereas you look at like old philosophers, they started in a gymnasium, which is like
Place to practice physical exercise.
well, the act of practicing physical exercise to acknowledge your mortality. Like, you're dealing with the experience, not the theology. The theology is even more removed than the belief, than the facts, but the personal experience. That
Well, but then ultimately, then maybe that's the takeaway from all this. That it's the personal experience that is important. That means that you as the individual, not only do you seek to become the highest expression of yourself, but you need to seek the greatest personal experiences that are available to you.
right? If we don't, we might as well be Plato's chicken, just like featherless bipedal.
All right. So to me, my view is always that, again, because I advocate for mastery of self. Once you're the master of who you are, no one can. Not only can they not claim it, there's little they can do to you, right? Because in self mastery, you'll find depths of courage that you never thought you could have or experience, and it's a personal experience. It's not, you don't measure it against anybody else. We're all on our own journeys, but the outcome can be the same: self mastery. And then it plays out differently in everyone because we all have our own different aptitudes and sensibilities, and those come to the surface. And so then because it's a personalized experience, you as an individual can have a more profound sense of satisfaction and a quality existence, and it doesn't come from the adherence to things that are transient or if the active pursuit of happiness in and of itself becomes kind of a dead end, because
Right.
happiness is a transient state. It means that you can't sustain it indefinitely. That means it has to come and go. And then if that becomes your focus, like, why can't you simply be happy? Well, I fucking can't, okay? So, right?
No, but it's one of those ethereal experiences. It's here, it's gone.
Right. But it, much like all the other emotional experiences that you'll have and thoughts, they're all transient in nature. But what you can actively do as an individual is you can actively pursue challenge that provides you a sense of achievement, from overcoming the challenges, satisfaction as because you made the effort to do it. That's directed by you, the individual, and that is sustainable, right? So long as you continue to challenge yourself and continue to, because then it leads to greater degrees of growth, right? And maybe that's what the Eleusinian mysteries represented, is the ability then to have a personal experience so that it could produce a personal evolution. Evolution, revolution.
No, I 100% agree, because this is the basis. I think by definition it's the basis of philosophy. It's this idea that you have curiosity, and it's fundamental to who you are. If somebody takes over your the system you react with,
Your cognitive function, your awareness.
right,
But
and your ego, all these things.
yeah, if it's being hijacked by somebody, now you're acting from someone else's bias that's been imposed on you, and then you accept it as it to be your own. When actually You didn't. You at no time were you ever required to. And again, this speaks to the uniqueness of the individual, right? That like you want to flesh out that uniqueness. You really bring it, flesh it out completely. Then that's how you do it. Like be in a constant state of challenge, actively pursuing goals, overcoming challenges, accomplishing things that you never that you didn't think that you could. That can be a perpetual state. The actual individual accomplishments aren't. They're not, but in the broadest sense that you can actively pursue them.
Right. Like anger and rage and happiness, all these things are a state of mind, but not a goal or a set place that you can end at. Curiosity is the same.
Yeah. So I think that you can drive it. Okay.
Yep.
Considering that we're having issues with the weather now, it's starting to rain. What's the time check?
We got an hour and 5 minutes. We're
How long's the episode?
1 hour and 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, that's good enough. We'll end on that note. All right, so I would just like to say in closing, sorry, I need my reference stuff. I would like to say in closing,
Rain, rain, go away.
Rain, rain, go away. Come again another day. Okay, question everything, including yourself. Seek balance, seek knowledge, seek understanding. Become a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical objective thinker. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day or night wherever you are.